Welcome back, young scholars. In this video, we will be discussing Southeast Asia. So that region would include the modern-day countries of Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Laos, Burma, Cambodia, Vietnam. The big questions you should be able to answer after watching this video are: how did Southeast Asia's location as a crossroads of interaction impact it culturally, politically, and economically? What are the origins of Buddhism and how did Buddhism spread? And what are the beliefs, traditions, and customs of Buddhism? So how did Southeast Asia's location as a crossroads of interaction impact it culturally, politically, and economically? Let's look at three objects that date back to the period around 1200 to 1450 in Southeast Asia. First, we have a Hindu sculpture of the god Brahma. That's the creator god. We have a beautifully decorated Quran, which is the Islamic holy text, and we'll spend more time on that in a later video on the Islamic world. You can see the beautiful calligraphy. We have a Buddhist sculpture. So what conclusions can we draw based upon these three objects? First of all, you're starting to hopefully develop a little bit of an understanding of these various religious traditions, and you'll know that none of those religious traditions originate in Southeast Asia. So all of these various religious traditions that clearly influence this region are brought in from other regions. And so one of the conclusions we can draw is that Southeast Asia served as a crossroads through which commerce and cultures passed. Another example of this is a temple called Angkor Wat. It can be found in the modern-day country of Cambodia. It was built in 1200 CE. It was originally constructed as a Hindu temple, and as we talked about when we learned about Hinduism spread in Southeast Asia, but eventually it was converted into a Buddhist temple when Buddhism took roots in that region. We see the way in which this region becomes a crossroads of these various religious traditions. And in some cases, they end up merging like they do at this particular location at Angkor Wat. Another example, this is a mosque built in Indonesia around 1550 CE. You can see more traditional Islamic architecture back here with the domes and the minarets. But this is also a minaret, which we'll learn about in the Islamic world is the place where people would go to make the call to prayer to encourage Muslims to pray 5 times a day. And you can see this is built with more traditional Indonesian style architecture. So we can see the combining and blending of these different cultural traditions within Southeast Asia. The two major cultural influencers of Southeast Asia were their neighbors, India and China. So Southeast Asian kingdoms were heavily influenced by their neighbors and trade partners, the Indians and the Chinese. Later, once we get into the 1400s, 1500s, we see the introduction of Islam into this region. And so we later see a lot of heavy influence by Middle Eastern culture. Why did Southeast Asia become this cultural crossroads and melting pot? Well, one reason has to do with geography. There are these major monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean region, and they blow northeast in the summer and then southwest in the winter. So these alternating seasonal monsoon winds allowed for sailing to take place, southwest from China and then east from India, and they would meet here at this little strait right here, which is in the modern day region of Malaysia and Singapore. And there's a city that formed in that location called Malacca. This is called the Straits of Malacca, where boats would pass through, traveling from India to China. And so markets emerged and cities emerged at that particular location. And as a result, Southeast Asia became this cultural melting pot. There were some major kingdoms that formed in this region, including a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. We use that term Hindu-Buddhism, really referencing a blending of both Hindu and Buddhist traditions. They grew very wealthy off of trade including this particular kingdom called Srivijaya. Now, Srivijaya was a maritime kingdom. As you can see, it transcends this Malay peninsula right here, and then this island of Sumatra. So Srivijaya, a Southeast Asian kingdom that you should be familiar with that name. This is a relief from a Srivijayan temple, and actually establishing a law code. You see some folks over here that are eating sea turtles. Here you can see what is happening to them as they are being clubbed and beaten to death. So don't want to eat sea turtles in the Srivijayan kingdom. Another major maritime kingdom of this region is Majapahit, and that was also a Hindu-Buddhist kingdom. And it's really the beginnings of what will eventually form the modern-day state of Indonesia. And then finally, we have in the 1400s a smaller kingdom called the Sultanate of Malacca formed right here, and it was an Islamic kingdom. So Islamic merchants had come to this region of Southeast Asia, and they had introduced their religion to this area, and we start to see Islam spreading rapidly starting around the 1400s across these various islands of Indonesia. Buddhist kingdoms would also form in the mainland of Southeast Asia, including this kingdom right here, which is called Khmer. It would eventually form the basis for the modern-day country of Cambodia. You also have the Sukhothai kingdom, which was right next to Khmer, and it would form the basis for the modern-day country of Thailand. So the basic rule you should follow is that when it comes to the mainland, you have more Buddhist kingdoms. When you get to the islands out here of Indonesia, you have more Islamic influences with a little bit of Hinduism kind of sprinkled in between. What are some of the goods possessed by Southeast Asianers that were in high demand in other parts of Afro-Eurasia? The major goods that Southeast Asianers possessed were spices, especially spices like nutmeg, which is this spice here, cloves and pepper. And some of these particular spices, like nutmeg, would only grow on one particular island because of the nature of the soil. And so these islands down here came to be known as the Spice Islands. Let's take a little bit of a detour, and I want to spend some time teaching you some context. We're going to go back in history and we're going to learn a little bit more about the religion of Buddhism. What are the origins of Buddhism and how does Buddhism spread? So Buddhism is based on the teachings of a historical figure named Siddhartha Gautama. Sometimes he's known as the Buddha or the Enlightened One. Here are two images, and I want you to take a second and decide which one of these two images actually shows Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha. And the answer is this one, not this one. This is a Buddha. His name is Budai. He is a follower of Buddhism from China, and he's sometimes referred to as the happy or laughing Buddha. But not to be confused with the original founder of Buddhism, Siddhartha Gautama. So Siddhartha Gautama lived around 500 BCE in India. That was approximately the same time as Confucius was living in China, and that was 500 years before Jesus of Nazareth lived. The Buddha's goal was to reform the religion that he was born into, which was Hinduism. His objective was not necessarily to start a whole new religion, which is what ultimately happened. In order to understand the religion, it helps to understand some basics of the life of Siddhartha Gautama. So Siddhartha Gautama was born to a royal family. He was born a prince. His mother was the queen. Her name was Maya. And according to Buddhist tradition, Maya was having a dream one night, and a white elephant came and visited her and impregnated her by inserting a lotus flower into her womb that would eventually lead to the birth of Siddhartha Gautama. So Siddhartha Gautama was born a prince through a miraculous birth. And we can draw some parallels there between Siddhartha Gautama and Jesus of Nazareth. We have a miraculous birth in both religious traditions. We have Maya in one tradition and Mary in another tradition. When Siddhartha was young, his father, who was the king, took him to see a fortune teller, and the fortune teller told the king that Siddhartha, his son, was either going to grow up to become a great king like him or become a great holy man. The father wanted Siddhartha to become a king. Siddhartha's father did everything to try and make that happen. Siddhartha was incredibly sheltered and privileged growing up. He was forced to live and stay within the palace where he had all of his desires attended to. And so desire really becomes one of the central important features and beliefs of the Buddhist faith. When Siddhartha gets into his 20s, he is able to convince his father to let him leave the palace for the first time. He leaves and he sees three things. He sees old age, sickness, and death. So really, for the first time, he sees suffering. He sees that human beings suffer. And this intrigues him, and so he runs away and he leaves the palace, and he becomes an ascetic. Ascetics were people who had given up every pleasure in life. For instance, Siddhartha started living off of like 1 grain of rice a day. And so he became very skinny at this point in his life, and some of the images show that. Eventually, Siddhartha begins meditating under a tree, and he does this for 7 weeks, so 49 straight days. And when he comes out of this meditation session, he has reached a new level of consciousness or awareness about the inner workings of the world. And this is called nirvana. So nirvana is a state in which an individual who achieves it has no desire and experiences no suffering, and it is the final goal of Buddhism. In the same way that moksha, this release from the cycle of reincarnation, is the final goal of Hinduism, nirvana is the final goal of Buddhism. Siddhartha at that time becomes the Buddha, and then he begins teaching others about how to achieve the state of enlightenment or nirvana. So as you watch this video, I want you to focus on the orange color, which is Buddhism. So Buddhism starts in northern India with the life of Siddhartha Gautama. It spreads quickly across India as a result of the conversion of an Indian emperor named Ashoka to Buddhism. And we see Jesus living 500 years later, Christianity spreading across from the Roman Empire. Buddhism, which started out in India, is now making its way along the Silk Road over here into East Asia. It's moved over into the Korean Peninsula and Japan, and now it's spreading down here into Southeast Asia. Well, initially, a lot of people in India converted to the religion because there was an emperor in India at the time. This is during the Mauryan Empire. A man named Ashoka converted to Buddhism, but Buddhism eventually is reabsorbed by Hinduism in India. In India, the Buddha becomes one of many gods in the Hindu pantheon or tradition of gods. So Buddhism instead spreads to East Asia, Korea, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Buddhism is spread primarily through the efforts of missionaries and merchants along these major trade routes, including the Silk Road and also the Indian Ocean sea lanes. Why was Buddhism so appealing? Well, Buddhism offered a more universal message. Buddhism talked about anyone being able to achieve the state of enlightenment or nirvana. And we talked about how in China that may have been very appealing to people who were used to more secular, non-religious traditions like Confucianism. It also was very appealing to women and the poor. We see opportunities provided to women in Buddhist tradition that weren't necessarily provided in other societies as a result of the patriarchy. Another important question that we're going to confront in this course is how do you depict religious figures like the Buddha? Well, initially, the Buddha was depicted through a number of symbols, like the lotus blossom here, or the footprint. So the idea was that the Buddha, while yes, he had human form, he also had unique spiritual characteristics as well. Now you'll notice here you see these swastikas. Do not be confused or concerned. Swastikas actually started out as a Hindu Buddhist symbol, and it actually means good luck. And eventually Adolf Hitler adopted them as a symbol of Nazi Germany, and of course Hitler makes everything uncool. There is something unsatisfying about praying to a symbol or footprint. So eventually we start to see Buddha depicted in more human-like ways. We start to see statues of the Buddha. Here we see the more traditional image of the Buddha sitting down with his legs crossed. His hands provides different symbols that he's trying to communicate. We see here at the top of the Buddha's head, there's a little protrusion. That's not just hair. That actually is a sign that he had achieved some higher degree of enlightenment. And so you have almost like his brain was swelling. You see Buddha oftentimes depicted with long earlobes, which represents the period of his life when he was younger and as a prince, and he was wearing earrings. As Buddhism spread, images of the Buddha start to take on the local characteristics of the region. So here we have 5 different Buddha statues, and I want you to try and match the location with where these statues were found. So the first one here is found in Persia, but it was heavily influenced by Greek sculpture. And so we see the Buddha depicted with more Greek-looking features. Here we have an image of the Buddha in China, so we can see him with more Chinese characteristics. This is an Indian Buddha. This is the Japanese Buddha, and this is a Buddha from Southeast Asia. So as Buddhism spreads, it starts to take on characteristics of those local regions, and so there's a term for this, and it's something that we're going to spend a lot of time talking about in the course, and that's the term syncretism, and it means the blending of different beliefs or cultural traditions, and that's going to take place in every major religion. So we're going to see this similar phenomenon with images of Jesus, and we're going to see it with art in the religion of Islam. As Buddhism spreads, it also starts to evolve and change, and that ultimately leads to different divisions or sects within the Buddhist faith. So as Buddhism spread, it split into a number of different branches with differing beliefs and practices. There are 3 major ones that you should be aware of for purposes of AP World History, and those are Theravada Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is primarily practiced in Southeast Asia, including the modern-day countries of Burma and Thailand. Mahayana Buddhism is the form practiced most commonly in East Asia, including China, Japan, and Korea. Tibetan Buddhism is practiced more in that region of Central Asia, parts of Eastern China that include the Himalayas and Mongolia. What are the differences in beliefs? Theravada Buddhism stresses more individual meditation to reach nirvana. They treat the Buddha as more human-like and as more of a teacher. It's very much about trying to get rid of your desires and end your suffering by living in a very simplistic life. And so there's a lot of Buddhists in Southeast Asia have chosen to give up everything and live in a monastery so that they can engage in more individual meditation. In the Mahayana form of Buddhism, it emphasizes more the divine nature of the Buddha. It offers some help to people being able to reach nirvana. So you have these guides called bodhisattvas, who were people who had achieved a state of nirvana like the Buddha. It's a little bit more spiritual in nature in the sense that it treats the Buddha as more of a godlike figure, and it offers a greater opportunity for a sense of salvation or an afterlife. And then finally, in Tibetan Buddhism, it is a form of Mahayana Buddhism that is somewhat of a blending of the two, because you have these religious figures called lamas who are teachers, and the most famous Tibetan Buddhist is the Dalai Lama. Within the Buddhist tradition, one of the major characteristics is you have a high degree of monasticism. The root of that word you should be able to see is monastery. So these are people who are living in a monastery who give up and renounce their worldly pursuits and devote themselves fully to spiritual work. These are monks or nuns, and as you can see, they give up their clothes, they cut their hair, they give up all of their worldly possessions, and they live a very simple life, trying to, through meditation, get rid of their desires to achieve enlightenment. In Buddhism, women were oftentimes given greater opportunities than in the general society because of the forces that exist with respect to patriarchy. And so women had opportunities to live as nuns in monasteries, and that gave them oftentimes a little bit more freedom. What are the beliefs, traditions, and customs of Buddhism? The Buddha has something to tell us. One is not an outcast by birth. One is not a Brahmin by birth. By actions, one becomes an outcast. By actions, one becomes a Brahmin. Remember, the Buddha was born in a Hindu tradition. In many ways, he was critical of some of the major tenets of that faith. This being one of them, right? Which is the nature of the caste system and the inequalities that arise in that caste system. He believed you're defined more by your actions than your birth. Here's another quote. Do not accept what you hear by report. Do not accept tradition. Do not accept a statement because it is found in our books, nor because it is the saying of a Brahmin. Be lamps unto yourselves. Those who shall rely upon themselves only and not look to anyone besides themselves shall reach the topmost height. In this sense, the faith becomes more accessible and it becomes more universal when anyone can decide for themselves what their faith is ultimately really about. And that distinguishes it again from that early Hindu tradition, which was focused more on the faith as delivered through rituals conducted by these Brahmin priests. The other aspect here is he talks about who can reach the topmost height in Buddhism, who can achieve nirvana. The answer is really anyone. And that is distinguishable also from the Hindu tradition where only the male Brahmins can achieve the goal of moksha, or the release from the cycle of reincarnation. So this more universal message may be one of the reasons why Buddhism was more successful in spreading than Hinduism. Buddhist belief is structured really around the Four Noble Truths. They really form the core of Buddha's teaching. If you had to name only 4 things about life that are absolutely 100% true, what would they be? When I've asked my students that in the past, I've gotten a variety of answers like love or death. One way to think about the Four Noble Truths is if you were going to the doctor and you were experiencing a problem. And so Buddha would say, what is the problem that all human beings share? And according to the Buddha, the essential problem that all human beings share is that we all suffer. There is suffering in life. And go back to the story of Siddhartha Gautama, right? When he left the palace for the first time, he experienced 3 things: old age, sickness, and death. And so those are the major ways in which humans suffer. They get sick, they get old, and they eventually die. When you go to the doctor, you sometimes ask the doctor, well, what causes that problem? Suffering. That's the second noble truth. The cause of all suffering is desire, the Buddha would say. In what ways do we desire? What exactly does this mean? So, for example, you have your eye on that certain boy or girl, and then all of a sudden, you ask them out and they say yes, and you're all excited. And then a week or 2 later, it's just you kind of have your eye on some other boy or girl. And that's this idea that desire is kind of inquenchable. It's the same thing with respect to possessions, right? You get that brand new phone, and then all of a sudden a new version of a phone comes out, and you just keep wanting more. Buddha would say that's what ultimately leads to our suffering. If you're going to critique the Buddhist tradition, this might be a place that you would take issue, because some people would argue, well, is desire always a bad thing? I mean, sometimes maybe I have desire to educate myself or to better myself. Is that leading to my suffering? To understand the third noble truth, we have to ask the doctor the question then, how do we humans get better? And the answer that the Buddha would give is the way to end your suffering is to end your desires. By eliminating desires, by ceasing the desires in your life, you ultimately will end the suffering that you experience. The fourth noble truth involves the prescription that the doctor will give us. So, Dr. Buddha, what is the prescription? Well, the fourth noble truth said the way to overcome your desire and therefore end your suffering is to follow this eightfold path to enlightenment. So, what is the Eightfold Path? Well, the Eightfold Path is really the moral ethical code that forms the basis for the Buddhist faith. It teaches Buddhists to have right view and right intention and right speech and take right action and to engage in a right livelihood or have a upstanding job, to engage in right effort and be mindful and to have good concentration. If you can do all 8 of these things, that is the way that we end our desires, that is the way we end our suffering, and that is the way to achieve nirvana. This is similar in terms of its structure to some of the later moral ethical codes that we will study in other religious traditions. So, for example, in Christianity, you have the 10 Commandments, which spell out some similar expectations or norms within that religious tradition. In Islam, we have the 5 pillars. One of the major similarities between Buddhism and Hinduism is that they both believe in the idea of reincarnation, that your soul is reincarnated into a new body. For Hindus, the cycle continues until they achieve moksha, the release from reincarnation, and they do that by doing their dharma or their duty to get good karma. Buddhists also believe in the concept of karma, but in order to earn good karma in Buddhism, you have to follow the Eightfold Path, and nirvana is open to anyone, whereas moksha is more limited. Let's work on a skill of comparison by taking 2 religious traditions that we've just learned about and putting them side by side and identifying what are some of the things that are similar and different about these 2 religions. Oftentimes, again, these are religions that are commonly mixed up in the West. So here's what I want you to do. I'm going to give you some topics and I want you to identify, is that something that is similar or different about Hinduism and Buddhism? First, let's talk about who is the founder. Do we know? Do we not know? What is the place of origin for the faith? Did the faith spread? Do they believe in God or gods? What is their approach to the caste system? Do they believe in reincarnation? Do they believe in karma? How do you earn good karma? And what is the ultimate goal in both faiths? After watching this video, you should be able to answer these 3 big questions. How did Southeast Asia's location as a crossroads of interaction impact it culturally, politically, and economically? What are the origins of Buddhism and how did it spread? And what are the beliefs, traditions, and customs of Buddhism? As always, thanks for watching.